Hey, it's Spencer from the Pros Closet, here today to help you give your bike a COVID checkup, because I know a lot of us have been staying home, staying safe, haven't been riding quite as much. Hopefully that's going to come to an end in the next month or two and you want your bike to be ready to go. So we're gonna take a look at this Juliana Strega that belongs to my wonderful wife, and this will be a way of showing you sort of the methodical steps to just kind of assess everything that's going on with your bike. We're not going to get into the details of how to adjust or replace any of these parts. This is more making yourself a checklist of things that need to get sorted out before you head out and ride this summer. All right, so this is a mountain bike, but a lot of these principles can apply to road or gravel bikes as well. There's obviously some things such as suspension that won't be quite as applicable, but in general, this methodical process of going through each system of your bike's components will be really helpful. So let's start off with something fairly straightforward, the shifting. Usually what I like to do is I will shift through the gears and just kind of get a sense for how things are working. If there's any hesitation in the shifting, that's an indication it might need to be adjusted, or perhaps you'll need a new cable. This bike is shifting relatively well. Although I should say that I probably would have been smart to really clean off the chain before I got into this. So while we're down here, we can also take a look at the cassette and the derailleur to see if there's any signs of wear on the cogs or the pulleys. Essentially, what you're looking for are teeth on the cassette that look kind of like a shark tooth profile, or if it looks like maybe a Nike swoosh in between the teeth. And that can indicate that the chain has worn out the cassette to the point where it needs to be replaced. Fortunately, this cassette looks like it's in pretty good shape. These Eagle cassettes are kind of expensive to replace, so it's good to see that this one is still looking relatively fresh. Down here, if we check out the derailleur pulleys, sometimes it helps have a little white rag in the background to see what's going on. And what's going on is these are super filthy. And again, I should have washed this bike before I checked it out. But the pulleys don't seem to be particularly worn. And this can certainly be an issue because these are plastic pulleys, and obviously a metal chain will wear them a little quicker. Now is also a good time to check your chain wear to see if it's been stretching. And to do that, you would use a tool similar to this Park Tool CC 3.2. And what you do is you just hook one end of the tool into a link, and then you see if the other end will push through the link down here. Thankfully, it is not doing that, which means that the chain hasn't stretched too much. This tool is kind of cool. It's got a 0.75 and a 0.5 on either side, depending on how much stretch you want to measure. I don't know if you can see that, but you can flip it around and measure the 0.5, because we just did the 0.75. And it hasn't really stretched too badly. Again, good news, shouldn't have to replace that. And while we're over here, we can take a look at this chain ring to see if it's been wearing. And fortunately, it doesn't look too bad to me. Those teeth are still relatively flat on top, and there isn't too much of a groove worn in between them. This is also a pretty common wear item on these SRAM Eagle single chainring mountain bike drivetrains. All right, so overall, the good news is that the shifting is not bad. I will say that the lever action feels a little sticky. So my suspicion is we should replace the cable and housing to get the best possible shifting performance out of this bike. It has been a bit neglected, unfortunately, so it is probably time to do that. Next up, let's check out the brakes. These are, as you can see, hydraulic disc brakes, and that's very common on mountain bikes. You'll also find it on road bikes and gravel bikes to a lesser extent. Some of these things won't be as relevant, of course, if you have rim brakes, but you can still go through those, check your pad wear, check your cable wear, check your adjustment. Very simple things to do, and honestly, it's a little easier to do on a cable actuated rim brake, but let's dive into these disc brakes. Similar to the shifting, I'll just start by feeling the levers on the brakes to see if they are pulling smoothly, returning smoothly. This is also a way to get a sense for if the brakes need a bleed or not, if they feel spongy, if they aren't reaching a hard stop at the end. It's probably a sign that there's some air in the hydraulic lines and they'll need to be bled. Not to worry, that's a fairly straightforward thing to do, and it's common with hydraulic disc brakes. I also like to spin the wheels to see if there's any brake rub, and the front wheel is great. Fortunately, not an issue there. so the adjustment seems good. All right, we'll also check out the rear brake to see if there's any rub, and I like to gently pedal the bike to hear if there is any rub, because sometimes the freewheel is a little bit loud. Okay, it is rubbing a little bit. It's rubbing once in a while throughout the rotation, not steadily. So this isn't necessarily a caliper adjustment issue. This is probably more of a rotor chewing issue. And sometimes rotors get a little bent. And you have to do it carefully, but you can take a tool like this Park Tool DT2 and just use it to just gently tweak the rotor back to straight so that it doesn't rub on the pads where it is rubbing. The other thing we have a look at when we're down here is pad wear. And this is not going to be easy to see on the video, so you'll have to take my word for it. But basically, the brake pads will wear down eventually, and you just want to make sure that this spring piece that goes between the two pads, that there's plenty of extra pad material between that piece and where the pads meet the rotor, because you don't want it to get to a point where it's metal on metal against the rotor. One last thing to look for as you're down here and throughout the course of the whole hydraulic line is just to see if there's any indication of leakage. Sometimes you'll notice dust collecting on the hose or at the caliper at the lever where some brake fluid has leaked out, because it tends to attract dust. And fortunately, that's not the case on these brakes either. So it seems like the brakes are in relatively good shape. It might be worth trying to true that rear rotor, get that rub out of it entirely. I think the brake pads there's still a bit of life in them. It's also good to have a look at the rotors to make sure they aren't particularly worn, but that's another thing that's a little harder to show you in a video. But another thing I'll say is I'm rather impressed that it doesn't feel like there really needs to be a bleed done on these brakes. They still have a nice solid feel, so that's a bonus. All right, next up, we'll have a look at the wheels on this bike, and that includes the tires as well. Generally speaking, I just like to kind of give it a visual inspection and also a spin. And that's a good way to tell if there's any sort of significant wobble in the wheel or the tire. So you see there is a bit of wobble in this front wheel. A little hard to tell whether that's the tire or the rim, but my suspicion is it's the tire. And sometimes that comes down to a fact that it maybe went flat in the garage and didn't get reseated correctly. The other thing to check out when you're down here is whether the tires are looking worn. And this front tire, the knobs still seem to have pretty sharp edges, which is a good sign, so I don't think it's too badly worn. And then you can also go around the casing of the tire to make sure that there aren't any cuts or nicks in the sidewall. Out back, it looks like the rear tire is a little more worn. You kind of see the side knobs are starting to lose some of their integrity. They're not quite as sharp as they were. The center knobs are also a little rounded. That's normal. As any of you probably know, the rear tire does usually wear faster than the front tire. Oh yeah, there's that brake rub. Definitely is not adjusted. It's also good to check your hubs while you're down here to see if there's any side-to-side play in the bearings. I just kind of take the tire and give it a little wiggle, and it should feel solid. Maybe it'll slightly flex, but it shouldn't be knocking around. There shouldn't be a loose feeling. This rear wheel seems good. So does the front wheel. And if you do feel a little bit of play, sometimes it's as simple as just double checking your through axle to make sure it's nice and tight. So the tires and wheels are looking pretty good. The only thing I'd say is that rear tire is starting to wear, but it's not to the point where I would want to replace it immediately, especially because this is a mountain bike. It gets a lot of hard riding, a little bit of abuse, and if the tire is still holding air, I would say you continue riding it until the wear gets significantly worse. The only thing I'd add is that you are probably going to want to add fresh sealant to your tires after a bike's been sitting around for a few months like this one has. And that's the case for mountain bikes or gravel bikes or even road bikes that have tubeless tires. Great, so we can check the shifting, brakes, wheels, and tires off of our list. Let's go through the frame. Frankly, this bike is kind of a little hammered. Kate went and rode it at Whistler last year. I'm a little concerned. I just want to make sure there's not any damage that we haven't noticed over the last few months. This is a carbon frame, so one of the best ways to check carbon frames for carbon damage is just to run a rag along the tubes and make sure it's not snagging anywhere, because if it's snagging, that could be an indication that the carbon is damaged and one of those little fibers is sticking up. And it feels okay. You also would want to do a visual inspection to make sure there's not any obvious dents or cracks, depending on the material of your bike, obviously. Another item to check, which I guess could fit into the drivetrain category or the frame category, is the bottom bracket, to see if there's any play in this bearing. Similar to your hubs, you just want to wiggle the crank back and forth to make sure there isn't any clunking or knocking. And you do the same thing up here to check the headset to make sure it's not loose, make sure there isn't any binding, make sure it's smooth and easy to turn the handlebars. So headset and bottom bracket, both looking pretty good. So the last thing we'll go over here is the suspension. And since this is a mountain bike, that's relevant. If you've got a gravel or a road bike, good for you. You shouldn't have to worry about it. This is sort of one of those things where you just kind of feel it and see if it seems okay. It's kind of a little intangible to say that, but when you compress the fork, you just want to make sure that it feels like the damping is controlling the rebound so that it's not super bouncy and so that it's not rebounding extremely slowly. Same thing would apply for the rear shock. And in both the front and rear cases, it appears to me that the suspension still is running pretty well. One thing I will note is if the bike's been sitting for a few months, it's not a bad idea to check the air pressure front and rear and maybe reset it to what you originally had it back when you were riding a little more frequently, just so that any air lost won't affect the way the bike rides. So one last simple thing to check is just to make sure that the seals on your shocks aren't leaking. Up here on the fork, you just kind of will have a look here behind the brake arch and make sure that there isn't any oil coming out from these seals. And those look fine to me. You can also have a look at the lower leg of your fork and see if there's any oil leaking from around the rebound adjuster knob. Remember, most forks have their damping in the right side, so that's where most of the oil would be leaking out of if you had a problem with your damper. Over on the left side, that's where the air spring is. And we do the same sort of general check through of the rear shock to make sure you're not seeing any oil leaking out of the seals of this. It's a little hard to see with Santa Cruz's VPP design. There's a lot going on down here. Sometimes it helps to put your finger behind the links to see if there's any oil, and it's just mostly dusty. Like I said, I should have washed this bike. So good news is that rear shock is doing pretty well also. Last thing you'll want to check is the dropper post on a mountain bike, of course, to make sure it's functioning correctly. And while this one does return nicely, it does seem to be sagging quite a bit when weight is applied. And that's quite annoying if you're out riding, if you've ever experienced that. That means that, unfortunately, this reverb will need to be bled. It's a hydraulic system, and it's also noticeable that the lever is pretty sticky, so that could be related to the need for a bleed. The last thing I like to check out is just the touch points on the bike, so that's the grips, the pedals, and the saddle. And generally speaking, it's just a simple visual inspection to see if there is anywhere that maybe would be of concern. And when it comes to the grips, you definitely are seeing some wear. And these are not very comfortable grips to begin with, in my opinion. So maybe it's time for a replacement. Saddle cover looks pretty good. There's no damage there, although this is a very roadie style saddle for a mountain bike like this, but whatever works. I'm not one to judge. And finally down here, these pedals honestly are kind of just on the bike so that we can ride it around. If you had clipless pedals, you just would want to make sure that there isn't any significant damage and that the bearings feel smooth. Well, I don't know if you've been keeping score at home, but there's a few things I need to address on Kate's bike before it's ready. One of them is the rear brake. It's rubbing a little and I'd like to get it adjusted, possibly straighten that rotor. The shifting is working pretty well, but I think it could benefit from a fresh cable and housing, a little bit of adjustment. Above all, this reverb is my main concern. I don't like how it sags when you put weight on it, and certainly the lever feel isn't good, so hopefully a bleed will resolve that, and this bike will be ready to shred this summer. Now, let me know in the comments if you have any questions or ideas, and I hope you have a minute to give your bike a little checkup, and then I hope you can get out and ride this summer. Thanks for watching.